Chapter 10, The Happy Ending.
Yes, he faces the music, as the saying goes. One thing we learn about Nate is that, despite taking the occasional bribe and despoiling a virgin now and then, he is the hero of our tale. He's a man. He's damaged, but he's grown. Our director, Rob Burnett, describes True Noir as a coming-of-age story, and I agree. It wasn't intentional, but by the end of True Noir, Nate is ready to be the hero of many more stories, up to the task. And I like to think that in my novel, True Detective, I came of age too. Or anyway, my writing did. Spoiler alert, if you haven't yet heard episode 10 of True Noir, unless you've read True Detective, stop right now and listen to it. Proceed otherwise at your own risk. As I've said, I wanted to explore the cliches of the private eye story to find the truth that fed the pop culture myth. The way Al Capone defined the gangster, the way Elliot Ness led to Dick Tracy. To come up with a private eye character who is a real guy, as real as any of the historical figures he encounters. This required that I bleed some of the fantasy out of the private eye, and using true crimes like the assassination of Anton Cermak helped do that. And it gave me something unique about my private eye stories, not just recycling Hammett or Chandler or Spillane. I do. And as mentioned in an earlier History Behind the Mystery, my original title for True Detective was in fact Tower Town. I thought that title invoked not just the Tower Town section of Chicago, but Chicago itself. Carl Sandburg's city of big shoulders, the towering skyscrapers of this great Midwestern metropolis. The original title, though, was too on the nose where the influence of the film Chinatown was on what was published as True Detective. I did mean to invoke that great film, not so much because it also was a private eye story set in an historical framework, but because the detective failed, or anyway solved the mystery but suffered in the aftermath, the consequences. Chinatown, however, Robert Towne's great script, is not a coming-of-age story. True Noir is. True Noir and its source novel chart the story of a detective who is literally, but unknowingly, looking for himself. The answer to whodunit in this murder mystery is, he did it. Nate Heller killed the kid in the window. He's been looking for himself all along. Yes, Elliot was on the way out of Chicago, and though he didn't know it, heading into exciting years of further crime busting, but in Ohio. One ramification of True Detective was my being asked to do a spin-off series of novels about Ness in Cleveland. I wound up doing 4 with Nate Heller appearing in 2 of them. Eventually, I wrote a one-man show about Ness and co-wrote with A. Brad Schwartz 2 nonfiction books about Ness in both Chicago and Cleveland and his later life. Since this journey started in a way with the Untouchables TV show in the late 1950s, it's perhaps fitting that I got the chance to set the record straight on America's most famous real-life detective. I think Nate Heller would be pleased. That was always my intention. I felt you couldn't introduce the audience to all these real-life figures and not let the readers, now the listeners, know what became of them. That's developed into a particularly popular aspect of the Heller novels, by doing a whatever happened to section at the conclusion of each story. It also enhances the notion that Heller is writing his memoirs and emphasizes that much of what we've witnessed in True Noir really happened to actual human beings, though some of our players may seem more human than others. Since True Noir weaves a private eye story in and around heavily researched history, this requires Heller to also let us know what happened to any major fictional characters in the proceedings. I have frequently been asked who Mary Ann Beame really was, and people often guess, using real actresses of the 1930s and 40s. Sometimes they announce to me they are absolutely sure they know who Mary Ann is. Of course, she's a fictional character, but it pleases me that people find her real enough to have actually existed. I think if a famous Hollywood actress had been raised by a chiropractor in Davenport, Iowa, and had a brother who was killed in a raid on Frank Nitty's office, we would probably know about it. Mary Ann was, of course, a composite of real actresses, but that's the extent of it. Well, just as the Century of Progress was a big deal in Chicago, so was the demolition of the buildings and other structural materials. A sad day, I'm sure, because the fair shone a bright light in dark times. Much of the fairgrounds are now home to Northerly Island Park and McCormick Place. The Balbo Monument, given to Chicago by Mussolini to honor the transatlantic flight of an Italian general, still stands near Soldier Field. The Museum of Science and Industry is housed in one of the only two remaining buildings from the 1893 World's Fair. As for the Century of Progress, 5 of the model homes of the future, with flat roofs and boxy exteriors and an Art Deco look, were moved to Beverly Shores, Indiana, and are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, leased to private individuals and families who restore them. The public has access to the homes once a year. The public does not have access to the home my wife and I live in that was based on one of these houses. He does, and that was part of the effort in the novel to present True Detective as a memoir. By the time I reached the conclusion, I knew there might be at least one more Heller novel, because I'd put aside material designed for a final section of the first book that could become the opening of a second one. So I was already thinking about Nate Heller's future. Since I wanted him to be more real than most fictional private eyes, he would have a wife and probably a child or two. As it happened, later books tell us Nate had 2 wives and 1 child. But all of that is another story.